In the book of Exodus, the story of Passover goes something like this. Please, long story, short sermon. The Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt and being treated horribly. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, instructing them to prepare a meal that included unleavened bread and a roasted lamb. The blood of the lamb was to be used to mark the doorways of all the Hebrew homes in the land, and on the night of the feast, the angel of the Lord would visit every home in Egypt and kill the firstborn of each family there, including animal companions and livestock and children. Those homes marked with the blood of the lamb would be spared this horrible fate. They were instructed to eat their meal while dressed for travel and to leave no leftovers. Moses and his people obeyed, and when the 10th plague came to the land of Egypt, the Pharaoh finally relented and let Moses and his people go free, lest any more horrible plagues beset his nation. Moses, Aaron, and all the others wasted no time in leaving, for they knew that the Pharaoh was not trustworthy and that they would likely be pursued as they fled. Now, this is a super simplification of a very complex story, to be sure, but it is the foundation for the holiday that has been celebrated for thousands of years, that reminds the Jewish people that once they were slaves in Egypt, and their faith and obedience freed them from that bondage. The overarching story of the Hebrew people is that of a group that has forever been in search of a place to call home. They were enslaved in Egypt. They were occupied in Judea. There have been many, many times of diaspora when they were driven from their home to wander and try and find a new place to be. The great temple was built in Jerusalem and then destroyed, scattering the people. Then the temple was rebuilt, and they had a home again until it was destroyed again, and they were scattered once more. Only a part of the ruins of the great temple remain, and faithful Jews and people of all faiths still pray at the remains of that one wall, tucking prayers written on little slips of paper into the many cracks and crevices of the wall, hoping that those prayers may be delivered to the divine and in one way or another answered. Cultural identity of the Hebrew people is rooted in thousands of years of trying to get a safe home. The 12 tribes of Israel scattered when north and south kingdoms split, and they have never been reunited. Although the yearning for a time of glory once enjoyed under King David has remained. Jews have encountered resistance, rejection, and oppression everywhere they have gone. The varied nations of Europe in turn welcomed and then rejected the Jews. They were forced into ghettos, permitted only limited occupations, and treated very poorly. In the first half of the 20th century, I skipped 5,500 years. In the first half of the 20th century, anti-Semitism was at a global fever pitch. Adolf Hitler studied the writings of Henry Ford and idolized him for his passion for industrial innovation and his hatred of Jews. Hitler had a picture of Henry Ford in his office. It is terrible to be a follower of Hitler. We can agree on that. But how terrible it must be to be the person Hitler admired. This is a part of our history, our U.S. history, that is not taught in schools. That's another sermon. In the 20th century, the area now known as the two nations of Israel and Palestine was the Palestinian state. This is where it gets tangled, so just bear with me. The UK supported the Zionist movement to secure a state within Palestine, mostly because it meant that the Jews would stop trying to immigrate to England. And in 1922, the League of Nations approved British rule of Palestine. The U.S. was not a member of the League of Nations, but the House and Senate both voted to support that plan. The history is long and complex, with conflict arising between Arabs leaving Syria for a safer place in Palestine and Jews leaving Europe for the same reason. This, of course, resulted in tensions and conflict. I know this is problematic, citing Wikipedia, but Wikipedia describes just one of the many efforts at outsiders to find a solution to, quote, the Jewish question this way. In 1938, the U.S. called an international conference to address the question of the vast numbers of Jews trying to escape Europe. Britain made its attendance contingent on Palestine being kept out of the discussion. No Jewish representatives were invited. The Nazis proposed their own solution, that the Jews of Europe be shipped to Madagascar. The agreement proved fruitless, and the Jews were stuck in Europe. Not that anyone asked them. It should be mentioned here that most nations in the world were closed to Jewish immigration in that time. Some Jews were able to move to the U.S., but many more were turned away, sent back to Germany to die in the Holocaust. Anne Frank applied for refugee status and was denied. So the U.S. pledged to support the creation of the State of Israel and support its right to self-defense. Americans, especially after the Second World War, were really reluctant to send more soldiers abroad to die. So the U.S. aid was primarily in money and weapons and money to purchase weapons. For decades, U.S. presidents have been trying to negotiate some kind of peace between Israel and Palestine. Jimmy Carter brought the parties to Camp David and forged an agreement that then fell apart. Bill Clinton again tried in the 1990s. All of their efforts have proven to be as successful as any other effort over the centuries of an outsider trying to reach peace between two warring parties who've been at it for millennia. The government of Israel seeks to expand its territory to include all of the Palestinian state. The government of Palestine seeks to exterminate all the Jews and reclaim all the territory that was cut up by foreign powers. And I say here, this is a gross oversimplification of this centuries-long struggle. I, as a white Protestant minister, raised Catholic, American, cannot understand the intricacies of this struggle, but I'm doing my best. Now, the governments of the two cultures became more and more radical and rigid, while for the most part, daily life of Jews and Arabs was lived in relatively peaceful coexistence. All the while, Israel, the government, kept expanding its territory, taking over great swaths of land in occupied Palestine, bulldozing homes and then erecting high-end housing for Israelis to move into. Palestine, for its part, has been something of an international pariah, rebelling against global support for Jews to have a home that was anywhere but every place else. The U.S. made a commitment all those years ago to help Israel defend itself. Part of that means sending Israel very powerful, high-tech, and expensive military supplies. And part of that means turning away from the reality of the expansionist behavior of successive Israeli governments. Palestine is now reduced to a tiny portion of the real estate it once called home. And after each conflict in which Israel demolishes some part of Palestine, the bulldozers move in, the land is claimed, and Israeli settlers move in to spiffy new apartments and homes, while the Palestinians seek refuge in an ever-shrinking Palestine. This does not mean that Palestine is without blame. Hamas, the ruling government of Palestine, seeks as its ultimate goal the eradication of the Israeli state and of all Jews. The people of Palestine, unable to overthrow Hamas, absorb the brunt of the world's reaction to those policies. Politicians in the U.S. have continued to support Israel since the post-World War II era. As a nation, we carry the significant cultural, historical guilt for permitting the Holocaust and rejecting immigrants seeking refuge from European anti-Semitism in the first half of the 20th century. Jews in the U.S. exert no small amount of political pressure on elected leaders to continue this support, and no politician is willing to offend that significant voting bloc, so the support continues. As Israel has expanded, conditions in Palestine have become more and more dire. Israel controls the drinking water and the electricity for much of the Palestinian territory. Checkpoints prevent people from commuting to their jobs or getting to their farms to tend their olive trees. More and more Palestinians are crowded into smaller and smaller areas. In July of last year, an expert with the United Nations declared the situation in Palestine as an open-air prison. Which brings us to our current day. Hamas attacked Israel on October 5th of last year. To outsiders and to the residents of Israel, it was viewed as an unprovoked attack and aimed at non-combatant innocents. Hamas took hostages and brutalized them. I say this was viewed as unprovoked in the same way the U.S. viewed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as unprovoked. Foreign policy of Israel, like the foreign policy of the U.S. in the 1930s, was deeply and painfully antagonistic to nations that in turn attacked with brutality. Now, there are some truths. Intentionally killing non-combatants is a war crime. Taking civilian hostages and sexually brutalizing them is a war crime. What Palestine, or rather what Hamas did in October was wrong, so very wrong on so many levels. And yet the response from Israel has been outsized in its brutality and severity. More truths. Intentionally targeting hospitals is a war crime. Intentionally targeting schools is a war crime. Intentionally targeting residential areas is a war crime. Intentionally stopping food and medical aid is a war crime. Telling people to seek shelter in a particular area and then bombing that area is a war crime. Bombing residential areas, then bulldozing the rebel to build new housing is a war crime. Killing 13,800 children is a war crime. What Israel has done in response to the Hamas attack has been absolutely out of scale. Committing war crimes in response to war crimes may feel cathartic, but it is still wrong. And U.S. students see the role of the U.S. government as immoral as it supplies munitions to the government of Israel. They are protesting U.S. foreign policy that permits or supports the expansionist agenda of Bibi Netanyahu. They are protesting their universities' investment in businesses that support the Israeli expansion. And universities, oh, God love universities, are responding as well to this generation of student protests as they have ever responded to previous generations of student protests, which is to say, terribly. Not unlike the systems within Unitarian Universalism, when our young people protested the investment of the UUA endowment fund in fossil fuels, the students of American universities are protesting the investment of their institutions in businesses that support the Israeli expansion. For the record, the UUA endowment fund is now fully divested from fossil fuels because protest works. University brass are under enormous scrutiny from right-wing politicians who want to yank their funding for being too woke. University leaders are desperate to offer Congress an image of order and respectability to avert the negative attention. And the students are being damned inconvenient by choosing this moment to protest that they don't want their tuition money to be used and invested in companies that supply bombs to Israel. The criticism of Israel's behavior in this moment is not anti-Semitic. We're criticizing the policies and actions of a government, not the faith and cultural identity of a people. There's a big difference, okay? We can criticize a government while respecting the people ruled by that government and seeing their humanity. Netanyahu does not represent the will of everyday Israelis any more than Donald Trump represented the will of everyday U.S. citizens. Netanyahu's popular support now, even after Rabbi Ruttenberg's article, has dropped south of 15% of the population there. Demonstrators on college campuses are not anti-Semitic. And Senator John Fetterman is completely wrong when he describes these demonstrations as similar to the neo-Nazi violence in Charlottesville in 2017. Here's the thing about protests. Yes, there are people who say horrible things on TV, and for the most part, those individuals are unaffiliated with the official protests. This happens. There are some folks who just like to stir things up and undercut the message of the real protest. They just love to instill chaos. I saw it happen in Oakland, California, and in Berkeley, and in Ferguson, and in St. Louis. And sometimes those disruptors, especially in St. Louis, are undercover police officers. But then again, that's another sermon for another day. The point I am making, and I promise I'm making a point, the humanity of Jewish people must never be called into question, ever. Every Jewish person in the world has the right to feel safe and to be unmolested by haters. And they have the right to be that anywhere they go. And the behavior of Netanyahu's government is absolutely abhorrent. Are there people on both sides who want the eradication of everyone on the other side? Absolutely. Is that position wrong? Absolutely. And they are in the minority on both sides. You all know religious educator C.B. Beale, yes? You know C.B. C.B. reminds us that more than one thing can be true at the same time. The people of Israel can be afraid of attacks from Hamas. The people of Palestine can be afraid of attacks from Netanyahu's government. Both are right to be afraid. And the people on the both sides of those conflicts are human beings. They love their children. They care for their parents. They don't want anybody to be sick or hurt. We must not lose sight of the humanity of others. Both sides claim historical ownership of the Holy Land. Both sides have legitimate claims. Both sides are right, and both sides are wrong in how they conduct themselves. Conflicting truths can coexist because truth is understood through the lens of lived reality. We all have experienced this. We have all at some point said, yes, I know the data, but this is what I have experienced, and I know this to be true. The Jewish people absolutely deserve to be safe. The Palestinian people absolutely deserve to be safe. So what do we do now? I wish I knew. I am inclined to support the student protesters. The idealism of our young people, of artists and intellectuals, generally points to the right side of history. Young people will write about the war in Vietnam. Young people will write about apartheid rule in South Africa. Young people will write about AIDS. Young people will write about the Occupy Wall Street movement. And young people are right about this. Young people don't want their or our tax money funding a genocide. Protesting genocide is not anti-Semitic. Holding governments to account is not anti-Semitic. It is the obligation of a world where we seek to recognize the humanity in each of us, to draw one another back into relationship where we can see each other's humanity. These are the waning days of Passover. I pray that the people of Israel and the people of Palestine come to a place where they can feel safe without having to kill anyone, and where they can feel safe without having to run and search and ever be homeless. Amen.